Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the Paleo webinar. We're going to talk about Paleo diet, the history of it, how to implement it, what is paleo, what food should you eat, what food should you avoid, and things like this. So let me just take a quick look here, make sure we have everything firing on all cylinders. Looks like it. We're recording. And I've got the screen share happening. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If I don't get to a specific question, just I'll unmute everyone at the end. We can talk about things. But let's get started right now on paleo. So I'm working from two monitors, so you may see me moving back and forth here. So listen, I want to welcome you again. Thank you for the time change. I appreciate that. We had some family things come up, and so I had to make things 2 hours earlier. I'm also going to stop sharing my video of me, if you don't mind. And we'll just do the screen share. There we go. Good, perfect. That's great. So my name's Mark Testa. I'm the Chief Wellness Officer at Pine Pollen Superfoods and Train for Longevity. Also run the Reversing Middle Age online coaching program. And these are both designed just for that, reversing middle age, helping people stay fit and healthy as we get older. And my mission in life, and really my passion, and it's been this way since day one, I've been taking care of patients for close to 30 years now, is to help people have optimal health through diet and fitness and lifestyle. And what we want to do with that, what I want to do is teach people that, and it's been my mission from day one in my practice, and you hear me say this frequently, is for you to be your own doctor. If you don't need me, that's even better. Then I'm doing my job as a doctor, because doctor means teacher. And that's just been my thing for 30 years of taking care of people. And the other thing too is I want you to not need the medical system so much. The medical system, while it's good for infections and, broken bones, it is not good at keeping people healthy. It is not good at necessarily preventing problems. It is not good at optimizing health. And in my career, I've seen way too much poor care, poor quality care, just because people get in the system and they're super busy and they can't, they just unfortunately become a number. And I don't mean it to sound so, cold, but that's what ends up happening. Hey, I see some people just joined. Thank you for tuning in. If you have anything you want to put into chat, please feel free. The time change, I'm glad you got my messages and just are able to make it. So thank you so much for coming. Good morning, Susan and Tammy. So back to why I'm doing this and why I do this. Again, I just seen too much poor care, really bad outcomes, a lot of waste. But what comes out of a lot of that is a lot of suffering too. And then, the only thing the system can do for us is give us a pill to take every day until we die. And I'm just not a big fan of that. I've just seen too much not good come from that. So let me see here. I want to see if we can just mute everyone. If you don't mind, if you could mute yourself, that would be awesome. Looking here for, this is not my first time using Zoom. You would think I know where all the controls are, but sometimes I don't. Anyway, so I'm here to facilitate this support, teach you, guide you, give you, help you make better decisions. And you're going to see that I'm not even all in 100% on paleo, and I'm going to tell you why. So real quickly, my story from fat to fit. So I went through a low period in my life 20 some years ago, and I used food and wine as my medicine to calm myself. And I put on 50 pounds. I went from 185 to 235. I got fatty liver. I became pre-diabetic. My triglycerides were through the roof. I had this big abdominal belly fat. And I remember going to the doctor, and no one ever asked me what my lifestyle was, what I was eating, what I was doing. They were worried about the fatty liver and the elevated triglycerides. Now, I'm barely in my early 40s at that point, maybe even in my late 30s. And nobody asked. They were worried that I had hepatitis. They were worried that I had liver cirrhosis from some other reason, non-alcoholic. They were worried about liver cancer, right? I had all these workups. No one said, what are you eating? No one said anything about that. And maybe back then we didn't have an understanding about how carbohydrates affect certain things and eating late affects certain things. And so, you know, had I not known better, I could have gone down the wrong path. It took me a while to wake up to the fact that I was doing this to myself, even though really I knew. And I remember the night I woke up, literally, I left my house in a rainy, like, November here in Colorado and drove to the grocery store to get Prilosec because Tums didn't work anymore. I had chronic, unrelenting heartburn that just never went away because I always ate late and I always ate too much. And I had reflux, and then I'd go lay down, and, you know, where that food's going to go is back up towards the esophagus. And I drove to the store and I went in and I got the Prilosec and I sat in my car and I opened it and I took it, and I felt like some kind of junkie out there. Like I couldn't wait to get this drug in my body. And I realized that night, what in the heck am I doing to myself? This is ridiculous that I'm going to the store in the middle of the night to figure out or to treat my symptoms when I know what is going on here. And thankfully that jarred me awake, and I was able to start to turn it around. And so I did a lot of different things to turn it around. I tried different eating styles, paleo, keto wasn't really around, some vegetarian, you know, just 6 small meals. You know, that was the thing back then. I started working out, and it took me a long time. It took me about 7 years to lose 25 of those pounds. And then a couple of years ago, I got turned on to fasting, and I started fasting, water fasting, intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding, fasting mimicking diets, and I was able to take the remainder of those 25 pounds off. And what was amazing is the fatty liver went away, right? The triglycerides got normal. My elevated inflammatory marker, the cardiac C-reactive protein marker, went from 17 to 0.03, 0.3, and it's supposed to be below 1. So I had all these signs of just bad health that were able to be reversed with nothing but diet, fitness, and fasting to a large extent. So we're going to talk a little bit about paleo, because to me, there's certain parts of paleo that are very important in that path. Just as in the next webinar I'll do next month on keto, there are certain things within keto that are helpful as well. Just like there are certain things within a vegetarian diet that are beneficial, just like there are certain things with fasting that are beneficial. I don't believe there's any one diet for people at all, including paleo. Now, again, I think there are bits and pieces of this that are important for us to understand and then find ways of implementing into our life. So you'll hear me talk about an 80-20 whole food plant-based diet, 80% whole food plant-based, which is just what it sounds like: plants, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, beans, olive oil, mixed with 20% animal protein. Now, that doesn't mean 20% of your calories coming from animal protein. That means of 21 meals, 20% of your meals are animal protein. Can you do that with a paleo diet? We're going to talk about that today. And then I intermingle all of these types of eating styles with intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding. So you're going to see sort of a blend of information here in this webinar, focused somewhat and largely around paleo. So that's my story. I've been able to turn it around. I'm being my mid 50s this year. I'm back down to my high school weight. My markers in my labs, they're sitting here right next to me. I just had my physical last month, are all back to normal. And so this can turn things around. We can reverse middle age, and we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. So quickly, I want to share with you some resources, and just a couple of them. I mean, we've got a lot, but I'll send out this recording a little bit later. But I really like this website, thepaleodiet.com. That's Lauren Cordain is his name, PhD. He's here in Colorado, at Colorado State University. He's done a lot of the research on paleo and grains and what eating grains do to our body with inflammation and autoimmune conditions for some people. And to some extent now we're hearing about lectins, which are plant toxins that were designed in the plant to keep predators from eating the plants. Now, we can cook a lot of the lectins away, but there appears to be quite a connection, maybe in about 20 to 30% of people, particularly around an autoimmune disorder, almost of any kind, because these lectins increase inflammation. And so Dr. Cordain has done a lot of research. He's written some good books. I think he's pretty level-headed with his recommendations. And so I want to recommend his website, thepaleodiet.com. Now, he's got a lot of research there. He's got great recipes there. And so I want to recommend that. Another really good resource for you going forward is Paleo Grubs, paleogrubs.com. And there's, again, recipes, some of the benefits of paleo, which we'll talk about. But, you know, some of these resources are helpful. And then I heard Rob Wolf speak earlier this year at a low-carb conference, and was pretty impressed by him and his knowledge. It's robwolf.com, R-O-B-B, Wolf, W-O-L-F.com. And Rob, again, is pretty knowledgeable, and I was impressed with his overall conversation. So just another really good resource here. Now, I'm not trying to make you as smart as a doctor on all this, but, you know, my goal is for you to be your own doctor. And in order to do that, you've got to be able to decipher what's marketing hype, what's BS, and what's real. And so these resources can help you do that. All righty, so let's talk about the history of paleo here. It's interesting, right? Grains are new to our society, and our ancestors, Paleolithic man, caveman, really ate quite differently. And so the paleo diet sometimes can be referred to as the caveman diet, the primal diet, or the Stone Age diet. It was, you know, obviously a simple way of eating. We didn't have the grocery store, and we didn't have refined grains back then. Grains have only come into our diet in the last 10 or 11,000 years. So not that long in the course of, you know, humans. And so it's a new food to our body, but yet we consume a large percentage of our calories from foods that are processed. And we've sort of drifted away from this more natural and evolutionary ancestral way of eating. And they didn't just harpoon buffalo and eat a ton of meat. They were hunters and gatherers as well. So they gathered small berries, and they had plants that they could eat, and they knew where there were seeds, and they didn't eat all the time. They ate less than more. And so part of the whole paleo thing that I believe is valuable is to also have time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting. We'll get to that. So with our latest sort of eating more of these refined foods, we've gained a lot of weight in America. We are 60 to 70% of us are obese or overweight in America. And the more we're exposed to obesity, the more we're exposed to that. It's an exposure. Think of cigarette smoking. It's an exposure. Being overweight, being obese is an exposure, and it can increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. It can increase the risk for diabetes. It can increase the risk for cancer. And these are the top leading killers in America. So I believe there's a correlation between obesity and our diet and these lifestyle diseases that are leading killers in America, right? Same with autoimmune conditions. Autoimmune conditions in the United States are growing at a faster rate than cardiovascular disease and cancer, meaning that it's growing faster. Now we have between what I hear sometimes 60 to 80 million Americans having an autoimmune disease. And if you have one and are on biologic drugs, you know those drugs are very, very expensive, running upwards to $100,000 to $150,000 per year. And pharmacy costs are one of the fastest growing costs in healthcare, and biologic drugs are the fastest category growing within that expense. So we're going to talk about meats, fruits, and vegetables being natural, processed foods of any kind really being unnatural. Again, that goes to grains, that goes to sugar, that goes to high fructose corn syrup, a lot of the things that are in our diet nowadays. So the modern diet is completely different from the way we used to eat, and our body can't adapt fast enough. Many refer to our modern diet as the standard American diet with the appropriate acronym SAD. So that is a sad state. And our paleo ancestors, again, I mentioned this, didn't eat all the time. They went many hours between meals without food, and many days without food because they just didn't have it. And you know, there was no obesity back then. They probably didn't live that long for other reasons. They got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or got an infection or something like that. But nonetheless, that way of eating, not always being full or in the fed state, leads to health. So what foods need to be avoided in a paleo type diet? Really, a lot of dairy, all dairy. Now, I add a caveat in there, except butter. I think there's benefits to butter. There's butyrate in there. Butyrate is a short-chain fatty acid. I'm sorry, yeah, it's a short-chain fatty acid. Butyric acid is what it is. That feeds the colon cells and can actually be beneficial. Now, if you're going to eat butter, you know, I like Kerrygold. It comes right off the farm. You can really smell it. Sometimes it smells barnyardish. What else needs to go out of a paleo diet? Grains. Grains to a large extent, especially refined grains. Rice, wheat, corn, barley, oats, millet, rye. Got to go. Or significantly reduced. Beans and legumes. Now, this is interesting. And I'm sharing this because, again, I said this earlier, there's some parts of this that are appropriate, same with keto, same with other forms of eating, vegetarian, vegan. But again, there is no one diet. So while paleo recommends no beans and legumes, the most researched diet out there, the Mediterranean diet, is very high in beans and legumes as a sustenance. So we have to take a lot of this and see what works for us, right? So while this might be great if you are a bodybuilder and you want 6% body fat, we know from the Mediterranean diets and from the diets they eat in the blue zones where people live to be over 100, that beans and legumes are part of their diet, that are a staple, that help them likely get to that longevity. What else needs to go? Starchy vegetables, potatoes, white potatoes in particular. Squash, again, you know, that's a high, potentially for some people, high glycemic food. And so you've got to see what works best for your diet and your lifestyle. Now, again, I mentioned Rob Wolf earlier at the low carb conference, and I kind of went into that a little skeptical because carbohydrates feed the good bacteria in our gut, vegetable carbohydrates. But I really came out of there realizing, like, look, if you have a belly fat, if you have fatty liver, if you have elevated triglycerides, if you are diabetic or pre-diabetic, you probably need to be on a low carb diet. And low carb is about 25 grams a day, maybe 50. Liberal low carb is 100. So I just put those numbers out there for you to start looking at what you're eating. Am I eating a low carb diet or am I eating a high carb diet? Because for some people, a low carb diet absolutely is critical to reversing, some of these metabolic conditions. So again, not any one particular diet. What else needs to go? Without a doubt, sugary foods and artificial sweeteners. Done. Cross those off. Get them out of your diet. High salt foods. Look, processed and smoked meats in the World Health Organization and other organizations in America are classified as a carcinogen. And yet we continue to eat them. We feed them to our kids. They're in packaged lunches. I have a daughter in public school, and sometimes these foods are given to them there. And I think of the analogy, would we let our kids smoke? Would you let a 7-year-old smoke? We know smoking's a carcinogen, but yet we feed them carcinogen foods. What else needs to go? Soft drinks and fruit juices. Think of a fruit juice, orange juice, a 6 or 8 ounce glass of juice. Might be 3 or 4 oranges. Now, would you ever sit down and eat 3 or 4 oranges in maybe 15 minutes? Likely not. If you did, you'd also have the fiber in there and other nutrients that slow down the absorption of the glucose. With juices, really of any kind, you're taking in 100% sugar right out of the chute, getting it into your system in 15 minutes or less, and your blood glucose levels are going to spike. And when that happens, insulin levels go up. And if you do that long enough, insulin becomes insensitive to the glucose, meaning there's not enough to carry it into the cell. So the body keeps releasing more insulin because it's just not sensitive anymore to pick it up and carry it into the cell. And then we get all this excess insulin in our body. And excess insulin is a storage hormone. It starts to store sugar as fat. Because that's what, if we can't burn it, if the cell can't use it, then the insulin pushes it into the liver. That's how I developed fatty liver. I had too much glucose floating around, too much insulin, and then my cells couldn't use it. So then it shoved it into the liver and I got fatty liver. And then when the liver's full, like mine became, it starts shoving it into the abdominal fat. And that's why I got this big belly. It started shoving all this extra calories into the omentum or the fat around the organs. And I got this huge belly. You see it in people. And when that stops functioning, there's no more room there, it shoves it into another organ. It shoves it right into the pancreas. And a new study out just this year, maybe even this month, I think it was this month, that when insulin shoves too much glucose into the pancreas, then the pancreas releases more insulin and you get on this vicious cycle. And then after a while, the cells within the pancreas can't produce insulin anymore. And now you've got a real problem of insulin dependent diabetes where you need to inject insulin into the body. Now you're really on a treadmill because now you're putting extra insulin in when you already had too much insulin. Now the body's not making it, and now you're going to get fatter from the insulin that you need to inject. So sweets, gotta go. Refined oils, equally as bad. And I'm talking omega-6 oils, plant oils, canola oil, corn oil, vegetable oil, whatever the heck that is. Those things need to go. I am still a fan of olive oil and avocado oil because there are benefits to that with studies that support the fact that those oils are helpful. So, what can you eat? We can eat a lot of stuff, really. And we're going to talk about this here. All lean meats. Now, chicken, turkey, fish, shellfish are fine. Now, you look into the keto world, or the low carb, high fat world, they would say also red meat. And I am a fan of an occasional ribeye. I have one maybe every 3 months. But look, it's not just muscle meat. If you're going to be a healthy paleo, you've got to eat nose to tail. What is that? Well, that's the organs. That is the liver. That is the heart. That is other organ meats that you can get from these animals. And there are places now that sell good quality tasting mixed up organ meats that you can, put on spreads and sandwiches. And but it's not just about animal protein, lean animal muscle, really, nose to tail. And that's what our paleo ancestors would have done. Had they killed an animal, they would have eaten the liver and the heart and probably the brain and some other tissues as well as the meat. So now let's talk about how much protein do you really need? It depends on your age and it depends on your goals. If you're trying to build a lot of muscle and you're pretty young, a good amount of protein is probably safe for you. But after about 40, when you get to midlife, too much protein turns on aging pathways. There's this pathway, there's these nutrient sensing pathways. They're just what they sound like. They sense the nutrients we're putting in, called insulin, right? It senses glucose. There's a pathway called mTOR, MTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, senses insulin, glucose, and protein. And then there's the AMP kinase enzyme system that is more of an anti-nutrient. Now, we'll talk about these. mTOR can turn on growth hormone, and cancer genes. And so overstimulating that with too much animal protein in particularly, not so much plant protein, but animal protein, can turn those genes on and cause growth, fat, cancer, aging. So how much protein do you need? We'll come back to that in a second. Can you eat enough protein from plants? The answer is yes. Plants actually have quite a bit of protein, and they don't trigger that mTOR pathway the same way that animal protein does. As you know, I'm a big fan, I mentioned this earlier, of the 80-20 rule, which is about 4 of the 21 meals a week being animal protein. And that's fine. So when I look at longevity studies, what are the people who live to be over 100 eating? How much protein do they get? They get 0.31 to 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you're 180 pounds, that's about 65 to maybe 80 grams of protein a day. You really don't need much more than that. I've seen people consuming 200, 250 grams of protein, and that can come with some downside because there's a lot of nitrogen released from proteins, which tax the hell out of the liver and can cause liver problems. And I've had people I've coached who've had elevated kidney markers from too much protein that they were consuming on a diet that was similar. What else can you eat? You can eat eggs. Big fan of eggs. Get good eggs. There's certain things within eggs, choline in particular, that can help prevent fatty liver. Fruits and berries, again, low, depending who you are. If you're somebody who needs low carb, you got to go low carb on the fruits as well, low sugar, which would be like blueberries and more sour things, green apples. Most vegetables, which have plenty of plant protein, nuts and seeds. And when I recommend nuts and seeds, I recommend raw and unsalted, plenty of protein in there. Honey, to some extent, can be utilized as well. And you got to be careful with honey because there's a lot of stuff that's imported. There's a lot of stuff that's mixed with high fructose corn syrup. If you can get local honey in your community at the farmer's market that's raw and unfiltered, that's the best. Why? Because it's unrefined. It comes with all the vitamins and minerals that nature had put in honey that helps us metabolize it without being a big problem. And I mentioned earlier healthy oils, olive oil, walnut oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. These oils are really fine. Now, the vegans are anti-oil, but these oils are called essential fatty acids for a reason. We need them in our body, and I'm just not convinced that having no oils is healthy. And there are other studies that point to a different story. So the paleo plate consists of, largely lean meats. Again, not all the time. Nose to tail, if you can do it. Vegetables and healthy fats. For example, last night I cooked chicken thighs and vegetable skewers. That was our dinner. Very fulfilling, very good, and that was my my day of animal protein. I would say I ate probably about 80% vegetarian this week. I just prefer it, and it works well. So these are the foods that really you can focus in on and do well on a paleo diet. Also important to make sure you're getting adequate water on these things, because water is important in many ways, right? Keeps us hydrated. Dehydration can affect everything from our digestion to our mood, and we lose a pint of water at night just breathing, and we lose about a quart of water a day just breathing. So it does come out in our breath. Obviously, we perspire. It's utilized as a metabolic tool for digestion and numerous other things where we need water. Including water to bind to toxins in the liver, so it could be carried out through urine through the kidneys. So we've got to drink enough water. Now, again, depending how much protein you're eating and consuming and what kind, you really got to flush it out with plenty of good water. And it's probably, depending on your age and your body size and your activity levels, closer to a gallon a day. And ideally, not right out of the tap water. You've got to be careful if you live in an old house with potential lead pipes. And, at minimum, filter it with a Brita or a Pure or a reverse osmosis. Ideally, if you could find spring water, that's even better. And so some of the benefits of plenty of water, which are important in a paleo diet, increasing the speed of metabolism. Right? A lot of people just don't drink enough water, and their metabolism slows down. It aids in digestion. It really does prevent fatigue. If you're tired or moody or grouchy or grumpy at the end of the day, you probably need more water. So before you go for food to try to soothe that pain, try water instead. It helps with detoxification as well, as I mentioned, because toxins bind to it and can be excreted out in the urine. Anyone have any questions at this point? Let's talk about the benefits of paleo here. Again, because we're removing and reducing a lot of the glucose and insulin and refined things that spike, refined grains in particular, which is what we talked about earlier, wheat, right? Wheat is in everything, and it's super refined. Bagels, brownies, muffins, scones, cookies, it's everywhere. And it's too easy to get too much of that into our body, and that is really not all that different than sugar, and can spike glucose levels and insulin levels. So by eating a paleo diet, it naturally balances glucose levels because you're eating more protein and fats. Protein and fats don't stimulate insulin, because really glucose is what does. Take that sort of with a grain of salt, because excess protein gets converted into glucose as well. So if you're eating a high amount of protein, you can end up with elevated glucose levels also. So again, 0.31 to 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Find your sweet spot. Tammy, what are my thoughts on sweet potatoes? Again, I think they're fine because for the right person. So if you can metabolize carbohydrates well, you are not pre-diabetic, you don't have fatty liver, you don't have elevated triglycerides, a sweet potato is fine. It's got a whole different makeup than a white potato. And for those people who can handle that sort of thing, I think they're great. And so I eat sweet potatoes. I don't eat them all the time. I don't eat a ton of them, but I do roast them up. And I have a breakfast salad I love them with. Sweet potatoes are great with black beans and quinoa. That's a dish I eat fairly regularly. So I think sweet potatoes are fine. Again, if you are not someone who requires a low carbohydrate diet for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I think that there's an increase in energy because you're consuming better quality foods here, and insulin glucose levels are staying more stable. And it's interesting. You can do just about any diet in the first 6 weeks, you'll see results, because most diets, whether it's keto, vegan, vegetarian, paleo, Whole30, Mediterranean, are just better quality foods. You're just not eating the crap of a standard American diet. So for short periods, any kind of diet will see results. What is, when I look at that, I ask, what is the longevity? What is the sustainability of the diet? Also, if you're eating a good paleo diet, you've got good, adequate amount of protein that the body can use to make neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin and dopamine and epinephrine and norepinephrine. And when you can make adequate amounts of these, and particularly serotonin, you can get better sleep and be in a better mood. So diet plays a role. There's numerous studies that show a vegetarian diet beneficial for mood disorders. There's numerous papers on that. Really, this can help you with weight loss as well, and lean muscle production or prevention of loss of lean muscle, and particularly as we get older. Again, remember we went through that insulin and glucose. When there's too much of that floating around, you can become diabetic or pre-diabetic. The insulin tries to shove the glucose into the cell. When it can't do that, it shoves it into the liver. When the liver's full, it shoves it into the belly fat. When it's full in the belly fat, it shoves it into the pancreas. And that's not weight loss. That's not weight loss at all. That's weight gain. And so keeping those glucose levels and insulin levels moderate to low is going to help with weight loss without much effort. Also with protecting lean muscle. So the body will convert, when there's not a lot of glucose floating around, it starts to look to fat to burn. And the majority of places it wants to go burn fat is from the belly. That's stored calories there. So it's going to go look for energy from the belly fat. And it's the difference between a fed state and a fasted state. So when you're not constantly fed, when insulin and mTOR are not always upregulated, then AMP kinase, I mentioned this earlier and didn't talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it now, is sort of the anti-nutrient. It's the anti-nutrient. It takes about 48 hours for that to get triggered, but the body knows after about 48 hours that it's not being fed, and AMP kinase increases. And when AMP kinase increases, it starts to trigger what we call autophagy, or cleaning up of and recycling old cells, dying cells, precancerous cells that are utilizing energy inefficiently, releasing certain things that are toxic to our body and metabolites that are actually speeding up the aging process. So when we're not in that fed state, when we're in the fasted state, and again, it takes about 48 hours, AMP kinase kicks in and starts to clean house. It's a nice tool. We've got these 3 nutrient sensing pathways that keep us in check, and they revolve around, certain nutrients, insulin, animal protein, and lack of calories. This type of eating style also helps keep you full. It has detoxifying effects because you're not putting refined stuff, because when you're eating a refined diet high in refined foods, you're getting trans fats, MSG, refined sugar, excess calories that are rapidly burned but don't keep you satisfied. And there may be disease prevention benefits to this. I think if you look at the literature on Lauren Cordain's website I mentioned earlier, it's pretty convincing. Inflammation is the key factor to the 4 major diseases of aging, which are diabetes, heart disease, arthritis, and dementia. And those are all largely triggered, again, with refined foods. And remember, I told you my inflammatory marker when I was sick and fat was 17 and 18 the following year. I've got that down to below 1 where it's supposed to be. You can measure this stuff. And if you don't know your C-reactive protein or CRP level, talk to your doctor at your next physical and get it checked, because it's really, really important to know what that is so you can see what your diet and lifestyle is doing to your health. Tons of research. We're not going to go into it. There are about 100 studies on the paleodiet.com research website. And if you want to take a look further there, I encourage it, because it's pretty impressive. Things even as simple as like acne can be controlled with a low-grain paleo-type diet. We mentioned this earlier, effortless weight loss can occur largely because you're getting away from things that are refined. And again, it's those refined things, insulin, glucose. It's this relationship between insulin and glucose that are driving these diseases, these inflammatory diseases of aging, inflammation, the mTOR pathway turned on and stimulating growth. And we know mTOR, when it's turned on, causes diabetes, causes cancers, and causes growth. And again, largely from animal protein and refined sugars. And so giving that pathway a break is critical to healthy longevity. And again, that's not just what we eat, but it's also the strategy of when we eat. So time-restricted feeding, meaning be done eating by 3 hours before bed and try to fast for 12 to 16 hours a day. Most people can fast between 7 and 7 because you're really sleeping a lot of that time. And when the body's not in a fed state, it starts to burn fat and you can get into ketosis. Now that's a big topic and a lot of people talk about ketosis, and being in ketosis is not about eating bacon and butter for 3 meals a day at all. It's about not being in that fed state for 15, 16 hours a day. It's about fasting for 15 or 16 hours a day. And then if you really want to get more benefit of weight loss and training the body to burn fat, then you do 24, 48, and 5-day fasts to trigger autophagy. And when you fast longer than 2 days, right, I said that AMP kinase pathway kicks in and you go into autophagy, you clean up the cells, especially if you're older, you want to clean that stuff up and get it out. But also after about 3 days, if you're doing a 5-day water or fasting mimicking diet, after about the 3rd or 4th day, the body starts to rebuild itself because it's been in autophagy, and it releases a lot of stem cells. Now that's also another buzz, stem cells. Stem cells are the future of healthcare. We don't have it quite figured out. They work really, really well in orthopedic conditions, knee problems, shoulders, hips, rotator cuffs, knee arthritis, chronically sprained ligaments, back issues, work really, really well there. But we don't have a whole lot of other data and results and safety on stem cells for other things. It's coming. But our body can release its own stem cells at a level that are safe and they're yours. So they're not going to do any damage because they're your cells. So there's a lot of benefit of getting into that fasted state. Paleo type diet also can be high in omega-3s and good quality oils because fat doesn't make you fat. Carbohydrates make you fat. And eating too much too often makes you fat. And when your insulin and glucose levels are elevated, it makes you fat. So this type of diet can be quite beneficial for weight loss that's not difficult. If you're an athlete, paleo can be a benefit for you. And again, because you're probably getting a overall better diet, sustained nutrition, and it can be helpful in improving muscle recovery. Again, because you're eating better, improved digestion. And it's not just what you eat, and it's what you absorb. So if you have improved digestion, you're going to absorb your nutrients better, your nutrition better, and you're going to feed your cells better. You'll have better glucose control. And remember, when we're not in the fed state constantly, we're into ketosis. We're burning fat. And so fat is a great fuel for our brain. You don't go up and down. There's no, crashes. And when you have good fat circulating, particularly the ketones, butyrate, butyric acid, I mentioned that's in butter, it's good for the brain. And so when you're burning fat, you're releasing ketones that are really actually good for the brain, which as we age is something we want to protect. Other athletes, professional athletes, have used this type of diet, namely Kobe Bryant was one of the first, and we know he had an amazing athletic career. Also, paleo type diet for many people can improve the immune system, because again, I keep coming back to the same thing, glucose and insulin. When you got a lot of glucose floating around, it feeds a lot of bacteria, and it's just, you're ripe for infections. It could be urinary tract infections. It could be GI bacterial overgrowth. It could be SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. It could be large intestine dysbiosis. And let's not forget, 70% of the immune system is in the gut. So when you've got gut infections, your immune system is upregulated. And when your immune system is upregulated, it starts attacking itself. And when it starts attacking itself, that's called an autoimmune disease. So we've got to be careful about that. Let's see here. Again, we mentioned this, paleo helps with inflammation and in controlling diseases of aging that can occur from too much inflammation. And remember, there's the four main ones: the disease of aging, diabetes, right? 90 million Americans are pre-diabetic. They're on their way. And we have a large diabetic population. Cardiovascular disease, the leading killer in the United States. Dementia growing at a rapid rate, and arthritis. And we do 700,000 to 800,000 knee replacements a year. That's a costly burden. They don't all work. They only last 10 to 15 years. We're seeing a younger population needing those at 45 and 50. If you need one at 50, you're going to need a second one at 60 or 65. And your function is going to go down the toilet, and your pain is going to go through the roof. I see it happen all the time, and your quality of life is going to be very poor. So we know that removing these grains and refined things out of the diet can be beneficial for inflammation and autoimmune disease and triglycerides, and all these things feed into those four diseases of aging. So let's look at some of the myths of paleo here. You must become a caveman. No, you don't. In fact, I think if you're going to eat this way, you need to eat nose to tail. You need to be realistic, and you need to pulse the animal protein. I don't think you'll get me as somebody who takes care of people to say your 50% of your diet needs to be from animal protein. I think the thing, yeah, you'll lose weight. Yeah, you'll reduce inflammation. But what are we doing to that aging pathway and those genes, mTOR and insulin? Those as we get older are as critical to monitor as your weight. And so there is a blend of eating animal protein with plants that you need to find your sweet spot, because 50% of calories coming from protein, you're not going to get me to agree on. Paleo is a fad. That's another myth. I mean, this has been around since humans were standing upright, and has only changed in the last really 11,000 years. But really, when did we start gaining weight? We started gaining weight in the 80s. You can see a trend when we went away from high-fat diets, when fat was villainized, and went high-carb. and with high carb came refined everything. And you can see the trend line right when the government's changed the eating prescription to more of a low-fat diet, and doctors recommended low-fat, people started getting fat. So this is not a fad. We need to go back to more of this type of eating. You know, another myth is an unbalanced meat-only diet. You know my opinion on that now. Meat-only diets, most paleo-type diets are about 50% or less of meat. So again, I recommend less. 80-20 is what I recommend. So I recommend a lot less for some people, especially if you're middle-aged, right? We don't need to turn on aging pathways any faster than we need to. And if you're going to do it, eat nose to tail. And you'll get plenty full, and it's not expensive, and it can be quite a easy way of getting good nutrition into the body. Let's see here. Important to read labels. I can't stress this enough. There are so many hidden forms of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, maltodextrin, honeys, different kinds of sweeteners that are in things that we might not assume to be refined sweeteners, and they are, and they're in a lot of different things. So it's important to read these things, and this even comes to the fact of these new what do they call it? Impossible meats, or these new meats that are vegan or vegetarian. They're still really highly processed, and I don't know that I recommend highly processed vegetarian just because you're a vegetarian. If it's almost better to eat a ribeye that's natural than it is a highly processed vegetarian thing for your health. In fact, it may be no better. It may be just a trade-off. So you just have to be careful. You know, again, refine. Read the ingredients. Make sure you know the labels. Pay attention, even if it says low carb, because a lot of times there's other things in there that you don't want. Let's see here. Yeah, just again, mix it up. I would recommend that if you're going to eat somewhat like this, again, you heard me earlier, there's some benefit of paleo, there's some benefit of keto, there's some benefit of vegetarian, there's certain benefits to a Mediterranean diet. So I think this way of eating is just another spoke in the wheel, and you've got to figure out what is right for you. And are you that person that should be on a low carb diet? Virta Health, if you want to look them up, Virta Health has a program, and they are reversing diabetes with a high fat, low carb diet. It's pretty healthy eating, but they've done it. They've published papers on it. It works well. And so everybody is different, but I think we can learn a little bit of all the good stuff from all these type of diets to implement into our lifestyle. I think really in any of them and all of them should be used with intermittent fasting and time-restricted feeding, because being in that fed state all the time keeps insulin and glucose levels elevated, stimulates that mTOR pathway, never triggers AMP kinase to do autophagy, and we just grow and grow and grow and grow, and we never recycle cells. And I think you can look at the population of Americans and say, yeah, obviously we're growing. We're fat. We're sick. In the last 3 years, life expectancy has dropped. It's dropped. And that is a dangerous signal that what we're doing is not right. We're not doing something right. So if intermittent fasting is new to you, again, try to be done eating 3 hours before bed. Start with a 12-hour fast, 7 to 7. And as you get better at it, as it becomes easier, then I encourage you to extend it up to 16 hours. There's plenty of places online that you can find recipes and ideas and suggestions on how to eat like this. This reminds me of my broccoli frittata that I make frequently. I steam broccoli, dice it up, saute it in a little bit of avocado oil and garlic, add eggs, sometimes Parmesan cheese. I use a good organic Parmesan, and bake that baby. And that is absolutely delicious. There are a lot of good places online you can find recipes and to figure out ways of eating that are good for you. Plenty of information online if you look at Lauren Cordain's website. Again, cookbooks, things of that nature. And then, and again, don't just make it bacon. I'm okay with bacon, and if you're going to eat bacon, get nitrite free. Get the ones without preservatives in them, or the I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Basically, it's nitrates and nitrites. Again, World Health Organizations and other organizations consider those a carcinogen. So we really want to try to avoid that stuff, that kind of thing. I'm just getting towards the end here, so I'm glad to take any questions. I think this is maybe an overstatement. Paleo rocks. I think a lot of the concepts within the paleo diet are appropriate. Absolutely. I think getting back to our ancestral way of eating. And look, I say this all the time. You don't have to even look back to our ancestors, to the Paleolithic, man. Ask your grandparents if they're still alive. I have an aunt in her 90. I have an uncle who's 95. I ask them, what did you eat? How often did you eat? Did you go hungry? Were there hunger periods? And they all say yes, right? They didn't eat all the time. They were farmers. They didn't eat breakfast at 7 o'clock. They were milking the cows at 5. They maybe came in the house at 8 later on and ate breakfast, not too much. They went back to the farm. They didn't snack. They came in maybe at lunch, maybe they didn't. We grew up in Ohio. In the summer, you work a lot because that's when you can work. You can't work outdoors in the winter. And so sometimes they would only eat 2 meals a day. That's ancestral dieting. That's ancestral eating. Not eating all the time, fasting frequently, and not necessarily even eating 3 meals a day. So there's a lot to take from this type of diet, but you don't have to look at caveman to realize that this is the right way to eat. And I recommend, if you want to read a good book about Homo sapiens, and it's a great book. It's called Sapien. The author's last name is Harari. And it's interesting, about 11,000 years ago, he talks about when we started to farm grains and grow grains and save grains and feed grains to animals and develop farms and have properties, that a lot of things started to happen. We started to get sick. We started to have wars. We started to kill each other. We had property to protect. It's quite an interesting read. I highly recommend the book. So this brings us to the end of the paleo webinar. I would love to offer you a free 30-minute discovery call. My calendar is there on screen. My email is there, doctesta@hotmail.com. But I want to just leave, and I'm open to any questions. So if you have some, put them in the chat. I'm glad to answer any of those. Let me see here, 1 second. I think it's really important for us to, again, I can't stress it enough, to eat a varied diet, to get adequate plants in our diet, to not get too much animal protein, to not focus only on one type of eating, like paleo, like keto, like vegan or vegetarian, but to find a sweet spot among all of those. And the one study that has been researched the most is the Mediterranean diet. And interestingly, about 40% of those calories, or even more, 45, come from carbohydrates, but none of those carbohydrates are refined carbohydrates. They're plant carbohydrates. And I mentioned this earlier, plant fiber, plant carbohydrates are used to feed the microbiome. So every person needs to find their sweet spot. If you are carbohydrate, if you have prediabetes or diabetes, or you have fatty liver, or you have belly fat, or you have other health-related problems, even cardiovascular disease, a low-carb diet might be the way to go. And it's going to take effort to eat the right, because there are low-carb vegetables that you can make. The cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, are low carb, and you can make a lot of things with those. So please just find your sweet spot. Next month, we'll be doing a webinar, I believe, on keto, and we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the benefits of keto and what's helpful for that type of a diet. And again, I wouldn't recommend 100% keto to most people, but for some, there is an important need for keto. So any final questions anyone has? Have anything in the chat? No? All right. Well, I really want to thank you for attending. I'm going to save this recording. I'll be glad to send it out to everyone who's registered here. There we go. And thank you for tuning in. Any questions? Anything final? Anyone? Anyone? Thank you for tuning in. And please feel free to share this with anyone who you think might benefit from it. And thank you for your following me online. Let me see. Yeah, thanks, Tammy. Yeah, I hope you're still seeing the benefits of that 3-month program. I really think for middle-aged people, what we learned and discovered and shared in there is the right way to go. And I'm always looking for flaws to it to make it better. So thank you for saying that. Longer fasting cycle. Yeah. Without the kit. I'm with you on that too. What Tammy's talking about is the fasting mimicking diet. It's a 5-day diet of fasting where you can eat food. It's prepared vegan food, soups, nut bars, things like that. And it makes fasting easier for 5 days. I did a 5-day water fast in early 2018, and a lot of benefit, but it's not easy. And it takes time to build your body up to be able to efficiently be in ketosis, to burn fat for that many days. And it does make you grouchy. It does make you cold. It does make you sleep poorly. But the benefits are very, very big. So we'll talk more about that in an upcoming webinar. I want to wish you all a great Saturday. Thanks for tuning in. I'll get this out here shortly. And we will see you hopefully at the next webinar. All right. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.